Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Middle East Brief. Today we are going to talk about the territorial fight against the Islamic State, the non-state actor that has galvanized global attention since 2015 and has been at the receiving end of the American-led military coalition's combat operations in Syria and Iraq. The world's media has descended on northeastern Syria, where the battle led by the Syrian Democratic Forces to retake the final little territorial enclave ISIS still controls in eastern Syria is in its final days, and the expected announcement of the territorial defeat of the Islamic State is expected to take place any day now. I thought it would be useful to get a sense of what comes after the fall of the territorial caliphate to look to Syria's east, to Iraq, which has moved on from major combat operations where ISIS has been territorially defeated and is now in the more difficult stage of trying to rebuild a society torn apart by the conflict against the group, and that has a lot of political challenges ahead of it as it tries to pick up the pieces from the conflict. So to talk about the lessons and maybe the challenges Iraq faces and perhaps what we will see in Syria, today we are talking with FPRI Fox Fellow Rasha Aqeedi. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Who, as I mentioned, is a FPRI Fox Fellow and is also the editor-in-charge of Raise Your Voice, a digital outlet that focuses on Syria and Iraq. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aaron.
It's a pleasure to have you on, and I think a good time to take our attention away from Syria, because I think the battle is just days from being over, and then the real challenges have begun. And Iraq is obviously a different case, but clearly there's something to discuss, particularly as it pertains to U.S. foreign policy. So with that, I mean, how would you judge the post-territorial combat phase against the Islamic State as viewed through the eyes of Iraqi politicians, and perhaps what it means for the U.S.?
It's different in Nineveh than it is in Anbar, for example. I believe that in Anbar it's been somewhat smoother than it has been in Nineveh. There are many reasons for that. I think Nineveh itself is very contested. It's more ethnically diverse. There are more actors involved in the province. Overall, it could have been much, much better. I believe that Iraq kind of lost an opportunity to completely, I wouldn't say completely, that's it's too heavy of a word. Let's say at least significantly cleanse the country from the ISIS underground networks. That has not happened. And I think initially when the areas were taken back from the Islamic State, we kind of, experts and analysts kind of agreed that 1 to 2 years would be the period that ISIS needed to kind of recollect themselves and get their act together and kind of step out more from the shadows, because the operations against like Iraqi forces and civilians, I mean, initially started pretty much 2 or 3 months after the city was retaken. But right now, they're more bolder. We just saw last week there was a VBIED in the east side of the city, in one of the most secure neighborhoods that has security forces from all the different apparatus are actually protecting it right in front of the university. And it went off and it killed 2 people and injured over 20. And the fact that they actually were able to plant a car bomb there, that tells you that they're becoming, more bolder in their actions. And it's just going to it's going to get worse from there. So right now they're in that stage where they're recollecting and they're regathering, and they're definitely stronger than where they were 1 year ago. Also, but we have to also be not so cynical about things. There's always this debate about ISIS today being a lot stronger than when they were before they took Mosul, let's say before 2014. I tend to disagree. I think right now they're in a phase that they know more, but they're also weaker. They have been handed a very, very heavy defeat, whether it's in Iraq or in Syria. Recruiting is not going to be as easy for them. The problem is that the Iraqi government is just not kind of seizing all these opportunities because of lack of political will, dismissiveness, kind of, I feel a lot of people are sort of still high on victory to realize that it's not completely over. And the further you get from Baghdad, the less important the province becomes. So all these factors are kind of playing into this, into ISIS's favor. That's how I see it.
No, I mean, I think that's important, and it's something that I think should be emphasized, and perhaps we can unpack a little bit here, is I've always thought that the territorial defeat of the Islamic State when they had congregated, particularly in cities, was more straightforward than when the group was quote unquote territorially defeated and then would retreat into the rural areas where it's actually more difficult to track and where it can carry out harassment attacks like this VBIAD in Mosul that you were talking about last week. So, I mean, I think with that in mind, I mean, in my discussions with Iraqi politicians before this, that they were aware of this, but perhaps don't have the best, but, just because they're aware of it doesn't mean that they have all the answers about how to solve it. So, like, perhaps you could walk us through some of the things that they're trying to do to address the looming ISIS insurgency to ensure that the group doesn't come back in any way, shape, or form like it did in 2014.
The thing is, I don't believe they're actually addressing it properly. I think we're kind of stuck with the same narratives, the same strategies that we have been that we had previously had before. Because here's the thing: there's already this experience is already there. The same thing happened back in 2006. The Iraqi government and security apparatus took the same measures to counter it, to address it, and it didn't work. It resulted in massive mistreatment of entire communities, resentment towards the military and towards the government, and then eventually it led to ISIS. So what we're seeing today is the exact same thing: massive arrests in certain areas. I hate having to go back to this, but we are seeing again some sectarian tensions that just last year were not there. This is happening again. You have the problem of displaced people. People have not been able to return home. There's a lot of anger. There's this feeling specifically in the west part of Mosul that the government is deliberately neglecting them. You have some statements from people I trust personally that heard this from military or separate individuals. And of course, we can't generalize. But there is this narrative kind of going around that this is actually a punishment for Mosul because of ISIS, because Mosul welcomed ISIS. This is what at least many of the locals are starting to believe. Last year, we didn't have this problem. There was a lot of trust in the government. People loved the military, the security apparatus, even the PMF, even the Hashd al-Shabi was not as resented as it is today. We're seeing this negativity kind of rising again. I think that's very alarming. As for how to counter these networks, you would think that they would have learned from 2006, from everything that went wrong from there. But we're kind of stuck in the same strategies again. So far, I don't know if there is. I can't talk on behalf of the Interior Ministry, but I do know so far we don't have a minister. So I have no idea how things are actually, being panned out over there. It doesn't look to me like there's a proper strategy, but I do hear from the counter-terrorist services that there are some arrests of local underground networks, not in Nineveh. I have heard it in Kirkuk, in Diyala maybe. I have not heard any in Mosul in particular. Perhaps in Mosul they're acting different, or they're carrying out a different kind of strategy. By them I mean ISIS. So far it looks much of the same. That there doesn't seem to be anything new, just massive arrests. When you hear about an arrest that includes 300 and 400 people, for me, that's a red flag, because it reminds me so much of 2006 and 2007 and 2008. And you ended up with a lot of young men who literally had nothing to do with the Islamic State or extremism at any ranks, just sort of rotting over there in prisons and having a hard time. Their families were not even able to see them. And that created so much anger. Kind of see that happening once again.
Yeah, and so something I want to pick up on is two things, particularly as they apply, because as they apply to U.S. foreign policy, because the CTS, the Counterterrorism Services, is sort of the shining example of positive outcomes of sustained U.S. engagement with the Iraqi security, or with an element of the Iraqi security forces. But I want to touch on that in 1 second. Something that you brought up, I think is really interesting, is that the change in people's perceptions from the liberation of Mosul from Islamic State, basically a year ago, to where we are today, and the growing sense, as you said, particularly in the West, of political disenfranchisement because of the inability or the lack of government response to the massive needs to rebuild. It reminded me of something that former Prime Minister al-Abadi said, I believe yesterday. We are recording this on Thursday, March 7th, at the inaugural Suli Forum, where he caught a lot of flack because he told the audience that only 8 women, a total of 8 women and children were killed, civilian children were killed in the battle, and that prompted a lot of outrage from people because that's clearly not true. Do you see that as indicative of the disconnect, maybe between Baghdad and Mosul, or the slip of a tongue of a politician who wanted to sort of take credit for a great victory, even though he was no longer in power?
I think both are true, but I think it kind of tends towards the second. I think because it was the West Side in particular was taken during his time, so he didn't want to have that responsibility because everyone and their family know that Mosul was, the city was taken back, of course, and it was expected to be a bloody battle, but it was tragic in many senses. Like the numbers of the victims are the civilian casualties are way, way above 10,000. We say 10,000 sort of because that's the number we're 100% sure of, but it's probably several times that number. And I just found it fascinating, the confidence that he spoke in. I think he also knows that several people will have his back, perhaps others will defend him, or what it told Mosul, and this was the perception I got from so many family members and friends still in the city, is that how little they mattered. It didn't even matter that they were just a number that people can sort of play with for whatever political purposes or whatever Abadi had in his mind, but it's just that they did not matter and how dismissive they were. And that was, Abadi, of course, is no longer in charge. But if this signifies how politicians sort of deal with the city, I think that's hugely problematic. Yep. And it's not a good sign. It does not reflect on them well. And I think it's kind of unfair. We anticipate positivity from Mosul if this is how it's being referred to.
That's hugely important, because, you sort of see it talked about in shorthand about trying to manage tensions between different ethnic groups and between, different political blocs that support different political parties, and how, ensuring that politics remains the outlet for these people rather than a very, very select few. It's a very small minority turning to violence that could disrupt hard-fought gains. I think that's important to say. And something I wanted to pivot to, because I think it then builds into the sort of the way the Trump administration is handling the Iraq file now, is that you see a lot of speculation, at least concerns from Washington and sort of the Iraq following community about intra-militia fighting, and particularly on the Hashd al-Shabi side, and whether or not outside of the CTS, the armed forces are maturing in a way that would ensure their professionalization as part of this longer-term effort to basically win monopolization of the use of force within the country, with the idea that that would help push down against groups like the Islamic State. So could you maybe talk about the sort of the dynamic between the Hashd, the Iraqi security forces in general, and maybe how CTS is viewed still by Iraqis writ large?
So how it's viewed by Iraqis in general, it's viewed with a lot of admiration, a lot of respect. I would say the CTS is probably one of the 2 or 3 topics that everyone in Iraq kind of agrees upon, which does not happen often. But how it's viewed within the political sort of circles and the other military circles, that's of course different. Yes, it is viewed as an American kind of project, but not in a way that it's when I say American project, I mean American investment, but not in a way that has any connotation of treason. Does that make sense? It is viewed as an Iraqi project with American backing, but not loyal to the United States, loyal to the country. I've never heard anyone accuse the CTS on any side of the Iraqi political or religious or sectarian, spectrum, accuse the CTS of loyalty to the United States. It's really important we emphasize that. The Iraqi public absolutely loves them and admires them. In Mosul, they've become like this hero, this kind of heroic figures. But within the other parts of the Iraqi security apparatus, it's not something I know in detail too much of, but the tensions, yes, they are there. They were there even during the battle to liberate the city between the federal police and between several, different groups of the Hashid, and how they viewed the CTS. Why exactly? Again, I cannot say. I don't know enough about that. I don't know exactly why. I did hear some interesting talk also, I think it was yesterday, in the Soli Forum about the CTS, something about the prime minister saying that he doesn't trust them, or they don't. I don't know exactly what was mentioned, but it was a bit controversial. And again, without a minister of defense or interior, I don't think this is the right time to kind of create these frictions that don't necessarily exist, at least not on the ground. I can only talk about Nineveh, and so far in the post-ISIS era, there has not been any clashes between the military, between these different factions. They've been kind of operating smoothly in coordination with one another. There hasn't been any tension, not with them or with the locals. Could that change? Because also we go back in the stage before 2014, in 2009 and 2010, there was no tension between like the local police force that answered more to the governor in Nineveh and the army. That happened later on, a year later on, because of politics. So could we see that scenario sort of repeating again, but this time with the CTS? That's also a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that worries me a little bit about the CTS, and you always have to place your worries in sort of like proper level of concern, and it's not the highest on my list, but it's not the lowest either, is that I always worry about the reporting structure and how they directly report to the prime minister, and whether or not that is a long-term sort of political challenge that will need to be remedied for the further health of Iraqi liberal and / democratic institutions. In that, clearly there will be an ISIS problem, for the foreseeable future. I mean, really, we should expect a diffuse rural insurgency. I think you won't find a single analyst in Iraq or the U.S. that disagrees on this point. But, does that lead to a scenario where the armed forces, or in this case, a branch of the armed forces, escape rigorous civilian oversight? Again, lower on my list of worries, but always something I flag in the back of my mind when I hear that thing. Not to discount bravery or their role in the liberation of Mosul to begin with. But I think a good pivot point to then link this back to the U.S. is, after, I believe, 2 years in office, Donald Trump finally made his way out to Iraq. And he caused quite a kerfuffle because of his refusal to meet with Iraqi politicians in Baghdad. And more broadly, you have an American foreign policy now that is overtly, I would say strongly hostile to Iran. And I think together, you place the visit and then sort of the U.S. rhetoric vis-a-vis Iran, that puts the Iraqi government, which shares a border with Iran, in a difficult place. I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the difficult balancing act the Iraqis face them in as they try and balance relations with their sort of most important partner, the United States, one of their largest neighbors, Iran.
Well, it's important first to highlight that the number of Iraqi politicians now, whether it's in the government as a whole or in the parliament, the number that actually want to maintain a good relations with the United States is a lot less than it was, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago. We have entire blocks in the parliament now that are overtly anti-American, and they don't try to hide it. And they are calling for the United States to leave the country. They don't want any relationship whatsoever with America. They're not necessarily pro-Iran either. It's just that they're not necessarily fans of the United States. So we're left with a president that's very diplomatic and very pragmatic, a prime minister. I would say before a few days, I believed, until last week, was also very diplomatic and pragmatic. He's recently kind of made statements that have made me come to question my judgment of him. And we have some politicians and we have people in the different ministries who also do still want to sort of coordinate this and at least achieve some kind of balance. Of course, we all know the Iranian position, or the position of the Islamic Republic of Iran, where it wants Iraq to go. We don't even have to discuss this, but
for the listeners, it might be of benefit to them.
Okay.
No, seriously.
Well, it's clear. It's clear that absolutely they are pushing for the United States to leave, whether it's in the foreign policy or the diplomacy as they refer to it, or they're more the hardliners, whether it's the General Qasim Soleimani, the IRGC. They do want the United States to leave. And it kind of feels like some of the just the attitude that this administration has sometimes does kind of make it easier for them. I personally did not make a big deal out of President Trump's last visit. I thought it was just a visit to the troops. I believe President Obama at some point did something very similar. It was not an announced visit, to meet Iraqi politicians. But the question is that why wasn't it, and why hasn't he met with Iraqi politicians so far? I wouldn't say it's necessarily a policy. I would say this is more about Trump and how Trump acts. It's not necessarily a reflection of how the United States wants to act towards Iraq, but it did put the politicians who want to achieve a good balance between the two. It did put them in a really hard situation. And you have these statements every now and then, we're going to use Iraq to counter Iran or to confront Iran or whatever. That's not a rhetoric that anyone really wants to use, because there's also this concept of sovereignty. It's a bit debatable, but when it comes in from the United States, it can easily be kind of manipulated, and it does put them in a situation where, okay, are you happy with this president who once said he wants to take your oil, and that Iraq actually should give all its oil to the United States? He doesn't meet with your politicians. He's withdrawing troops from Syria. He might withdraw them from Iraq too as well. And now he comes to the country. He doesn't tell anyone. And now he's saying he's going to use Iraq as a base to fight another country. How does that make these politicians look? Not so good. On the other hand, you have a more prolific, active, Islamic Republic, in Iraq all the time, meeting with everyone, announced or unannounced. We don't even know, but very much more in control, and it has more to show. It is very problematic, and that's why this time around they kind of had to speak up. When that last statement was that we're going to be using Iraq to confront Iran, everyone on the political spectrum spoke out against it. There was no way to justify it. It was kind of a saving face kind of thing that they had to do. They had to speak up against it, and they had to refuse it very publicly.
I think that's an important point. I mean, for the last question that we'll wrap up on is, we're coming up on, as I call it, the sillier season, as the Democratic primary really starts to kick off, and you begin to have a serious overt campaign for the next presidential election in the United States. Mm-hmm. You clearly, I mean, mm-hmm. you are from Mosul. I think we should have said at the outset. This is you are truly an expert on this topic, and you obviously know Iraq better than I ever could hope to. But if you were to give a piece of advice to the U.S., both on the Trump administration side and for those that are trying to establish a counter foreign policy, or one that to show some differences between the Trump administration policy, what would be your advice? As you begin to look at the Iraqi, if you were to get the Iraqi portfolio on day one, given the challenges that we talked about on this podcast.
I mean, I would just invest more in the counterterrorism services. Also, if there was a possibility to sort of be more involved in the interior, I know that's very hard, but the interior ministry, because right now to face ISIS, you kind of need, or the ISIS network, not the Islamic State Caliphate, but the networks and the insurgency that is already, we can already see it quite clearly. At least we do in Mosul. You need a fight. You don't need a fight. You don't need an army. You don't need a fighting force. You basically need just good intelligence, and that's something Iraq still very much lacks. So investing in sort of this kind of security help for assistance for Iraq would definitely diffuse at least the significant threat of the insurgency kind of rising again. And I think when it comes to the Islamic Republic, I think it's in Iraq, and there's no way you're going to completely uproot the Iranian influence. It's way, way too late to do that. If you're going to do that, that's going to cost you the entire country. There's just no way to do that at this point. And I think continuing to stoking this point reflects very badly, and it definitely backlashes. So these are the few venues that the United States can help with. I think continued support to civil society, institutions that Iran is not so infiltrated in, that is not completely in control not completely in control of. Let's say education, health ministry, and it's not just Iran; it's the other factions that are also anti-American. But it's this narrative of then, let's leave the country, let's end the war, let's bring our troops home. This is what kind of scares me, because I feel it has, if we're going to go back to the United States, I feel it has its fan base, and it speaks to Americans who do truly want this war to end, who don't want Iraq to be another like Afghanistan, where they're in the country for like 20 some years. And that's kind of confusing. That for me, that's kind of confusing, because on one hand, you do have, we don't want an additional U.S. presence to confront Iran, as many on the, let's say, the more Republican side are kind of pushing for. At the same time, we don't want a complete withdrawal when the country does still need the United States assistance. So drawing that balance is that these are the areas that the United States can definitely help. However, I find because I talk to politicians too and different analysts, it's much easier to speak to people involved in the military than it is with politicians. It's like these micro level details, they don't understand them and they're just not interested. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It's so hard to tell them, okay, so these are the areas where you should be investing in. They just don't get it. Like, okay, so do you want another like surge of 50,000 troops? No, we don't want a surge. We just want some sort of an assistance, some sort of training. The training programs should definitely continue. Even just, with the U.S. Air Force being there, at least if there's an urgent cause for it to be there. That's what the United States can do for now. I think pushing up and continuing to stoke the Iranian card, that definitely backfires. It backfires on Iraq.
If I could maybe just summarize, so like you would de-emphasize the counter-Iran narrative within the U.S. in favor of an emphasis on building law enforcement and intelligence collections capabilities to go after Islamic State networks, and a general investment in sort of the key institutions of Iraqi society, like education, health, and civil society, so that you could play a positive role. So it's downplaying sort of the focus on combat operations in favor of building up the capacity of the Iraqi government.
Exactly. But the thing is that when you strengthen Iraq, that's a counter-Iranian strategy in itself. Because here's the thing, Iran doesn't, and I don't think it's done this in any of the countries that it has heavy influence in, or at least like negative influence in. It's not able to do this on its own. It does definitely exploit the weaknesses in societies and in governments, and overall just in the capacities of institutions. This is when it manages to sort of infiltrate, and it does it not necessarily with good intentions. But if you strengthen a country, these different, factions are gonna struggle. Like right now, Iran doesn't really have to actually do so much, because it has these players on its behalf, these proxies carrying out a lot of its own work. But if the institutions are strong enough, if the Iraqi government is capable of kind of putting itself together, if security-wise we don't need their assistance with combating these, underground networks or the insurgency, if the health system is powerful and strong enough, the education system is strong enough, that's another way to counter. And I think it's a more affordable way probably. And I don't think it makes the United States, like the American public would not be upset with this, because it doesn't look like an ongoing war. Iraq becomes more of an ally than a burden.
Right. And I think that's a good place to leave it. Certainly there'll be more to talk about in the future. And I hope that we can have you back on the Middle East Brief sometime in the future to get an update on everything that's going on, and particularly as we continue in the American domestic political debates about your home country of Iraq. So the invitation is open for the next time something in the news pops up that we can discuss on the show.
Sure, absolutely.
So thank you for coming on, Rasha, and thank you everybody for listening to the inaugural episode. And there's more to come this way. Please feel free to head over to our website at fpri.org, where you can subscribe to our Insights newsletter, where we will be sharing this link every time there's a new show, about once every 2 weeks on a Monday. And you can make sure to subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. And considering we are a new podcast, make sure to leave a review. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And thank you again, Rasha.